A hearing was held on Capitol Hill Wednesday to address police brutality and racism in America. It comes one day after George Floyd was laid to rest in Houston, Texas. Floyd, of course, killed at the hands of Minneapolis police officers more than 2 weeks ago. His death sparked protests not only nationwide, but around the world. Floyd's brother, civil rights leaders, and law enforcement officials were among those who testified before Congress on Wednesday. Skyler Henry has the latest.
I'm here today to get justice for my brother.
Philonise Floyd joined several other witnesses to deliver powerful testimony to the House Judiciary Committee, one day after he and his family buried his brother, George Floyd.
My family, they just cry every day and just ask why. He pleaded for his life.
Mass demonstrations have erupted around the world, calling for change in police practices in the aftermath of George Floyd's death in police custody. Another witness, Angela Underwood Jacobs, also lost her brother, federal officer Dave Patrick Underwood. He was shot and killed while guarding a federal building during protests in Oakland, California 2 weeks ago.
Where is the outrage for a fallen officer that also happens to be African American?
Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle vowed to work towards solution, but Republican committee members also bashed calls to defund police departments.
If you believe that we should defund the police, will you please raise your hand?
This is really not about defunding police. It's about funding other things.
The hearing comes days after the Democrats introduced their massive reform bill, the Justice in Policing Act. Senate Republicans are also working on their proposals.
White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Jared Kushner met with Senator Tim Scott on Capitol Hill Tuesday to discuss police reform.
I want the White House to finish their process as we finish our process, and then we'll have an opportunity to compare notes in the next day or two.
President Trump is expected to travel to Dallas Thursday to meet with religious, community, and law enforcement leaders.
And Skyler Henry joins me now from the Capitol, and we're also joined by Jacqueline Alemany. She's a Washington Post reporter and anchor of the Power Up newsletter. Skyler, I want to start with you. There was a moment during the testimony of George Floyd's brother where he seemed to pause to compose his emotions. It was really a moving moment. How was his message received by lawmakers there?
Well, Lana, I don't really think that Philonise Floyd has really had an opportunity to grieve his brother's loss. He said that during today's hearing, and what he was really calling for was change in terms of police departments across the country to make sure that what happened to his brother doesn't happen to any other person of color or person in general ever again. And I think that similar sentiment was echoed by other members or other witnesses, I should say, who testified before Congress today. We heard from the family's attorney, Benjamin Crump, who said that if there isn't any sort of accountability whatsoever, that this will continue to happen again. But as you saw in the piece there are several witnesses on the opposite side of the spectrum. Angela Underwood Jacobs, whose brother was shot and killed during protests in Oakland, California, as he was trying to protect a federal building. He was a law enforcement officer, and so you see just the dynamic that is being impacted by what's going on here. And now you had some lawmakers question that phrase again, defunding the police, and what that really means, and if it's appropriate in terms of dealing with police reform here. Obviously, a lot of the members of the GOP are saying otherwise, but members of the Democratic Party say that they don't want to defund the police either. They just want to make sure that appropriate money is going where it needs to go, and of course, make sure that what happens to George Floyd never happens again.
And I want to bring Jackie in on that point. We've heard more calls from activists recently saying that defunding the police is necessary. We haven't seen any, obviously, no Republicans have signed on to this idea, but it isn't really one that's gotten a lot of headway with Democrats either. So what exactly are activists hoping for? And is there a way that Democrats and Republicans actually see eye to eye on some of the reforms that ought to be happening?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of moving parts here. But I think what we're seeing right now is activists trying to push the ball forward, defund the police, as you've heard them cry for, but Democrats really, Democratic lawmakers really distance themselves from that. You haven't had one Democratic lawmaker come out and support it. And if anything, they have emphasized the fact that the Justice and Policing Reform Act actually doesn't even do anything to shrink police budgets. I've talked to people on both sides of this, activists, organizers, people who have been training people to get out on the streets right now and work towards defunding to the police. And then I've talked with lawmakers, actually Congressman Jim Clyburn this morning, who protested and was a demonstrator in the civil rights movement in the 60s. And he thinks it's really just a big distraction. And that if anything, it's become this cultural wedge issue that Republicans have seized onto in order to, paint Democrats as liberal radicals who want to disband and completely, get rid of law enforcement. At the end of the day, while both sides agree on finding police reform, there is very little that they actually agree on. You have Democrats who just unrolled their legislation, and you have Republicans in the Senate led by Senator Tim Scott, the only Black senator in the upper chamber who's a Republican, crafting the GOP police reform plan. There is little, agreement on those two bills at the moment. You had actually Tim Scott already say that he doesn't see a path forward for a lot of the federal bans that Democrats have introduced on policing tactics, like bans on chokeholds, overhaul of qualified immunity, and the creation of a national database to track police misconduct. But at the end of the day, this is all about really what the president is going to support, and we still haven't heard anything from him yet.
Right, and on that point, Skyler, as we're talking about Republican Senator Tim Scott meeting with White House officials on Tuesday, do you see perhaps in the Problem Solvers Caucus or some other way that there will be any reforms put together that can be agreed upon by Republicans and Democrats, since it seems like this call to defund police has become something of a distraction from what Democrats and Republicans could actually do, since neither of them are on board really with that idea?
Well, I think that the significant thing here is that both sides agree that something should happen, but as Jackie was pointing out, figuring out what exactly, I think, needs to be ironed out a little bit more. If anything, that's what these hearings are for. The Senate Judiciary Committee is actually holding one next week to echo a similar conversation that was had today, just hearing from witnesses, trying to get a better understanding as to what is deemed appropriate. Now in the effort in terms of national registries and things like that, just making sure that police departments across the country point out the bad apples, so to speak, and actually have some sort of database where all of those people are actually put on some sort of a file for everyone to be able to access. I think that was something that was mentioned earlier today, and they also mentioned that they want issues of police misconduct, as well as if officers are fired as well, for that to be accessible as well. As you know, in some of these instances, an officer may be let go of a police department and then get another job in another jurisdiction, a few months down the road. And so from what people who are calling on this national registry are calling for, they want to make sure that there is something that is accessible by everyone, obviously the people who do the hiring, but from the public as well, to make sure that these officers, these quote-unquote bad apples, bad actors, if you will, don't have an opportunity to wear a badge and hold a weapon ever again.
Yeah, and we're already seeing the police union speaking out against a lot of those calls for reforms, those proposals. Skyler, sticking with you, in an interview with CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell, the former vice president, Joe Biden, said that there is systemic racism, but it's not just in law enforcement. He says it's, quote, in everything we do. Talk to us some more about how the Biden campaign is addressing these calls for a reckoning for the racial inequities that continue to exist in our country.
Well, in the matter of policing in and of itself, I think the former vice president and presumptive Democratic nominee said that he wants to create a national standard for police that all police departments across the country will have to follow. And because of that, you have some critics who say that that doesn't necessarily work. What happens in one city may not be applicable in another. But the former vice president did say that he thinks that, what could be on the balance here is federal funding and holding that in terms of making sure that police officers remain decent and honorable. Critics there say, well, how do you measure decency and honorableness in an instance like that? But the former vice president did say that he did like some of the things that he saw from what the Democrats rolled out earlier this week, and that includes making lynching a federal hate crime. That includes banning those chokeholds and, of course, that national registry as well that we were talking about earlier.
All right, Jackie, last question to you. President Trump was really widely condemned after he suggested that the 75-year-old man that we all saw being pushed to the ground by police during demonstrations could be part of a, quote, setup. On Wednesday, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany issued no regrets, saying instead that the president, quote, has the right to ask those questions. Jackie, how have Republicans reacted to this?
Yeah, well, look, this is a dynamic and a game that Republicans are very well used to by the fourth year of the Trump presidency, with a president who has consistently dabbled in conspiracy theories, racist and sexist memes, and uttered some pretty incendiary things on his Twitter feed. Republican senators, some have learned how to dodge those questions in the hallways of Capitol Hill more gracefully than others. But the broader trend here that we're seeing is that Republicans have calculated that the most politically expedient thing for them to do is to ignore commenting on every single one of the president's utterances on Twitter and instead distance themselves just enough so that the president, one, doesn't criticize them, or two, maybe even is still willing to come out and rally for them in a tight re-election year. But what we are seeing right now is those vulnerable Republicans like Susan Collins, Cory Gardner, finally actually start to create a little bit more distance than we're seeing. And so I think that, as the polling has indicated, with Americans getting behind this idea that systemic racism has caused inequities in policing, and with a vast majority of Americans supporting these protests that we're seeing crop up around the country, you're going to be seeing, I think, these vulnerable Republicans distance themselves from the president even more.
Well, Skyler Henry and Jackie Alemany, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.